Hello.
If you wanted to just introduce yourself to the group, a little bit about your background and how you came to find Julia Greeley.
Okay. I think you want me to say something about that.
Yeah.
Okay. All right. I'm a Capuchin Franciscan, a member of a religious order in the Catholic Church. And
each time he sits
when
there,
I was, long before I came to Denver, I read an article in the Denver Catholic newspaper about Julia Greeley, a little short article. And in the course of that article, it mentioned she was a secular Franciscan. And I kind of put that away thinking someday I need to investigate that. And then after I moved to Denver, I found that note again, and I actually started researching her, and almost immediately I ended up starting to write a book about her.
Wonderful. Perfect. Thank you for sharing that and giving everybody just a little bit of background about you and your story. I think with that, we will move into your presentation on Julia Greeley, if you are all set for that.
Okay. This building is, this is a 1935 picture of it. It's over in the Curtis Park neighborhood in the area which is now called the Rhino or River North Art District. And it's a picture, a building on Walnut Street that Julia Greeley lived in for about 12 years. It's she lived in some other buildings in town, but none of them as long as this one, and this one is still standing. Today, the building incidentally was built in 1902, and Julia Greeley was in it already in 1903. So she was one of the early people in this building, and not a whole lot of people ever lived there because by 8 years after her death, this had already become a commercial building, and remains the same. This is what it looks like now. Planomatic on Walnut Street. I think they call it 2911 Walnut Street. Planomatic provides photographic and other graphics to realtors and architects. And we'll leave that for now. This is a map of the various farms out to the west of Hannibal, Missouri, about 12 miles west, almost directly west of Hannibal, where Julia lived. As far how much of her life she lived there, we don't know. There's a lot we don't know about her, but this little marker I'm pushing around was the limits of this property. Belonged to a man named Samuel B. Caldwell, and he gave a right of way through his property to the St. Joseph and what was it? The Hannibal St. Joseph Railroad, which was the first railroad that went all the way across Missouri. And this station here was eventually named Woodland, but during his lifetime, it was called Caldwell, and that's Caldwell, Missouri, was where Julia Greeley spent her youth. We don't know exactly when she was born. She didn't know, and a lot of people try to say how old she was, but we don't know for sure. I'm going to leave that now. Oh no, I'm not. Up in this corner here, you can see a little chapel drawn on the map, and that actually was on this.
Father, you actually had, oh, there you go.
It
Sorry.
was on Caldwell's property, and it's still standing. It's the only building on his property that is still standing from that era. Should be, as far as we know, she was emancipated by the state of Missouri's declaration at the end of the Civil War. The Emancipation Proclamation of Lincoln didn't apply in Missouri because it wasn't part of the Confederacy. But she might have been freed even before that. So he could have freed her. We have no reason to think he did, but or she could have escaped. But the next place we pick her up is in St. Louis, Missouri, where she worked for a woman and her family, Elena Robinson. Elena Robinson was a daughter of the mayor of St. Louis. She was and a daughter of one. Well, she's a great granddaughter of the founder of St. Louis. So she was sort of in the upper crust of society there. Julia worked for that family as a housekeeper, maid, cook, whatever, for about 9 years. During the course of this, she had met this woman I show here, who is Julia, Lena's sister, who eventually married William Gilpin, who was the first territorial governor of Colorado, long before he married her. But Julia Gilpin moved with him out to Denver, and after working for the Robinsons for 9 years, she wrote to Mrs. Gilpin asking if she could come out here and work for her. So that she did. This is the house, the manor of the Gilpin family. It was on 18th and Champa Street. This picture is taken from an 1880 book, so it was at the time when she was working there in this house, taking care of the Gilpin's children, and for a while cooking and doing other things. That building is gone a long time ago. It's that site is there's a residency Inn by Marriott there at 18th and Champa. Mrs. Gilpin was a member of the Catholic Cathedral here in Denver, and the family she grew up in was for a century or more had been a strong Catholic family there in St. Louis, and the governor was a Quaker, and he didn't get along with Julia Greeley all that well. He was not happy at having her there in the family, but he allowed it because his wife asked for it. During her time working for Mrs. Gilpin, Mrs. Gilpin introduced her to the Catholic Church, and she in 1880 she actually was baptized in this church, which is still standing at 28th and Larimer. It's right in the middle of the art district. She became very much a strong member of that parish and was into everything that they did. She got involved in it. She was baptized there just a few months after this church was dedicated. this is a picture of the inside of the church. And there's a little, down here in the bottom left, there was a pew that held 2 people. She rented that pew right underneath this big crucifix. The crucifix is no longer standing there, but it's over on a wall somewhere right about here, not mounted on the wall, but she was sitting right under that, and also right practically underneath the pulpit. But she rented that thing, that place. During that time, there were some of the higher class people who like to bring their friends to the high mass on Sunday to listen to the choir and so forth. They went to the pastor and told him that she ought to get rid of this Julia Greeley, who's up there, because she comes clopping in. She is dressed in all hand-me-down clothes, and she doesn't belong in that part of the church. She belonged in the back of the church. And Father, I think I have his picture here. Father Barry told them Julia Greeley can sit anywhere she wants in his church. And he says, she said, I could go to some other mass. He said, you like this mass, you come where you like to be. So she and Father Barry were very good friends, and he defended her against a lot of people who said a lot of mean things to her. Moving too fast. This building is on Lowell Boulevard, right across the street from Regis University. This building is on Hooker Street, just 2 blocks west of Federal, and in the 4200 block. And these are 2 buildings that Julia Greeley worked at. She worked with the Gilpins for about 2 years, and she eventually decided to go elsewhere, and took employment in various families as a domestic servant. She was passing this particular building one day, actually towards the end of her life. Mrs. Agnes Urquhart, who lived in this house, was sitting on the porch, and she noticed her going by, and she asked Julia if she'd come in and mop her floors. That's not something you would hear somebody saying today, but that's the way Julia made her living, and said, sure. And she came in and started mopping the floor, and after a while she came back to see Mrs. Urquhart. She says, I notice you have all these religious pictures hanging in this building, and a crucifix and so forth. You must be Catholics. And Mrs. Urquhart said yes, and so they talked about that a bit, that Julia belonged to Sacred Heart Church and so forth. And then she went back to her mopping and thought a little bit more, and she came back. She said, if you're Catholic, why aren't there any little kids running around in this house? And Mrs. Urquhart said, well, I did have a son about 11 years ago who had a condition that he couldn't digest food, and he starved to death. The doctor told me I couldn't have any more children. And Julia Greeley said to her, well, I'm going to pray, and you'll see that there'll be a little child running around here next year. And this is a little child. She actually was born the following year. And Julia came and started working for that family, taking care of the child, and actually would take her out in various places in a buggy. She wanted to take her down to Sacred Heart Church, and Mrs. Orkart said, I don't want you to go on that far with her, but she allowed her to take her over to St. Catherine's Church on Federal, which is very close, about 4 blocks away. And this picture is the only picture we have of Julia Greeley, and that's the little girl, Marjorie Orkart. We have that picture only because Miss Marjorie gave us that picture, gave that picture to the to a Father Kennedy, who was trying to get some information about Julia and was interviewing people about her. And she gave this only picture we have to him. And of course, it's been reproduced so many times now that we'll never lose it, but we could very easily have lost that picture. This next house, the little house over in the Cole neighborhood, to the north and east of Sacred Heart Church, it's just a half a block away from Annunciation Church, and it's one of a number of houses that we know that Julia Greeley visited, because the people that she visited later on left information about her visiting their homes. Unfortunately, we don't know where any of the buildings were that Julia Greeley used to visit at nighttime, distributing food and clothing and fuel and whatever she thought people needed, because there are a lot of very poor people in the area. This actually, during this time, the 1893 panic happened here in Denver, actually in the whole country, but it was very strong here in Colorado, and tens of thousands of people were unemployed, and there were a lot of poor people. We don't have any idea where any of these homes were, but we know that there was an awful lot of them. And I want to just read you something. This is written at the time when she died, to give you some idea. This is in the newspaper. She said her charity was so great that only God knows its extent. She was constantly visiting the poor and giving them assistance from her own slender means. When she found their needs so great that she could not help them with her own goods, she begged for them. Her charity was as delicate as it was great. She realized that white people, no matter how poor, might feel a little sensitive about receiving assistance from an old colored woman, so she went at night to their homes to deliver the goods she had begged in order to keep the neighbors from seeing her, and she went through the back alleys. She had ever been seen going through the streets at night with a mattress on her back. Many and many times she was seen carrying coal and groceries, yet she was so poor herself that the city charity department had been furnishing her with fuel and groceries. We'll move on. This is the St. James Hotel. It was near 15th and Champa. In 1893, it caught fire, and one of the fire companies that came to fight the fire, I think it was the first company that got there, was from a station over in the 5 Points neighborhood, about just two blocks away from the 5 Points. This building is still standing across the street from the modern fire station. It's empty, and but it has a little marker on it indicating it's a historic site. In you notice there's 5 people on the picture, and they're quite possibly the ones involved in the St. James Hotel fire, in which that whole company was wiped out, except for one of the black men was the only black fire company in Denver at the time. And they had a white captain, however. But one of the black men was off duty that night, but all the rest of them ended up dying in that fire. And this is another picture. We don't know it's exactly these 5 men, but could be. After that, there was in Denver. I've read that there was a much better relationship between the whites and the blacks for at least for a while, until later on the Ku Klux Klan got started here in Denver. It became very prominent and was very repressive of both the blacks and the Catholics. Anyhow, Julia Greeley, having heard that these firemen, and she probably knew them too, because she used to go all over the neighborhood on foot, visiting people, and she got to thinking that she should do something to help them, that the firemen of Denver, be prepared for a sudden death, which could easily happen to any of them. So she was involved in the parish in the apostleship of prayer, which encouraged people to pray daily and keep themselves, in her mind and in anyone's mind, I guess, is keep them prepared for a sudden death. She went all over Denver to all the fire stations every once a month, and passed out these little leaflets to the firemen. She also to a lot of other people in town. The Jesuits who ran the Sacred Heart Church said that she promoted more of this than anybody else they ever knew. Oh, this is going too fast. This is Captain Terence Owen. He was the fire chief, one of the fire chiefs at the time, and she went down to visit him one time to tell him that she was handing out these little leaflets, and he got the idea she was selling tickets for something, which she often did for the parish. They had raffles and so forth. She would get involved with and go out and sell tickets. On this particular occasion, when he saw her coming, he said, "What are you selling tickets for now? The orphans' ball or whatever?" And she says, "No, Chief, these is tickets for heaven." And he says, "Well, I want one of them too." And she said, "Well, you can have these too, but you're not the first to get them." You said, "But you're the chiefest." And anyhow, talking about these raffle tickets she sold, one time the girls and the young women in the parish had a beauty contest, and they sold raffle tickets. See how many they could sell and who would win the beauty contest. Julia Greeley was, you've seen her picture. She actually had lost one eye as a little child on the slave plantation. A slave master, and she was sick, and her mother stayed in from the field to nurse her, and the slave master came in and started beating the mother, and in the process, the whip caught the eye of Julia's right eye, and so she was blind in that eye the rest of her life, and it was always oozing fluid, and in general, she was not what people would call a beautiful woman, but she went to all the firemen in town and sold them these tickets, and she came back and won the beauty contest with something like 300 and some votes. Okay, we'll move on. In 1918, in June 7th, she was on her way to church. She went to church every morning, and she was especially devoted to the Sacred Heart, which is actually a way of talking about Jesus, his love and mercy for mankind. She was on a feast of the Sacred Heart, and she was coming to church. She was only about a block away from where she was living, but she right near the church, she became ill, and they took her into this home. It's a triplex right across the street from the church on 28th Street, and she was taken into this end of the house, and the priest came over from the church and administered the last sacraments, and then she was taken to the hospital. Allison found this picture. If I'd looked at the two of them, I thought this would have been the older one. Actually, the picture I just showed you, when the picture was kind of, when the building was all painted up nice, was I took that myself about 10 years ago. And this picture was just taken, which shows how historic buildings can go down very quickly. When Julia Greeley died, because she lived in a boarding house, the pastor had her body laid out in a little chapel, which the parish owned down on Ogden Street, Loyola Chapel. This building is still there at 2550 Ogden Street. It's I forget the name of the church that's in there, but it's an African American community. The original intention was that on this site they owned property, and they were going to build what is now Ignatius of Loyola Church, which did not get built here, but it's over on York Street. When she was buried in this, when she was laid out in this church, there was no television, no radio. The means of communication were not anything like they are now, but immediately people started coming from all over town, and people were really surprised at that point to see how many people's lives she had touched. This is an article that appeared in the Denver Catholic Register, and I can't read all of it here because it's covered up by me and Allison. But the heading for that article, it's a 5-tiered headline, which reads, "Highest honor ever paid to dead lake, here goes to Negress. Miss Julia Greeley, a former slave, most wonderful apostle of the Sacred Heart. Years of heroic piety bring old colored woman privilege of dying on her loved patron's feast day. Body lies in state 5 hours before altar while throngs pay her honor. Her charity knew no bounds." That was a very long article, but there were other good-sized articles in both the Denver Post and the Rocky Mountain News, front page articles talking about Julia Greeley and just how the whole city had found out that what she had been doing. She was buried out in Mount Olivet Cemetery out at the edge of west edge of can't think of the name of it, but anyhow, just out where I-70 turns south, the cemetery is. It was an unmarked grave for a long time, but about 35 years later, that Marjorie, that little girl, and her mother put this stone on her grave, and it was there until just very recently. The Julia Greeley Guild, for about 100 years, all sorts of people have been talking about how Julia was a saint and she should be canonized, and they're always talking about how her cause was coming. Well, her cause wasn't going anywhere because the church had never opened it. And in 2011 is when I started looking at this book and started writing it. But a priest who lived in the same friary with me here in North Denver, he was the pastor of Sacred Heart Church by then, and he called together all the different groups that were indicating an interest in Julia Greeley's cause for a meeting, to see whether we could do something to open that cause. And at that very first meeting, and that was in 2011, the Julia Greeley Guild was started, and about a year later, I finished writing this book, and the Guild published it. And within about 4 or 5 years, the Archdiocese decided they would open the cause, and they asked the permission of the office that governs this in Rome to open the cause, and they did so in 2016. And they spent 2 years gathering everything they could find that would help indicate that Julia was a person, not just a good person, but she was an exceptionally good person who heroically lived the various virtues. And as part of that cause, the church always requires that if it's possible, that the body of the person be found and identified. And so her body was exhumed out in Mount Olivet. I had the privilege of attending this, and I got an invitation saying that this would be done between 9:30 and 4:30 on a particular date. Well, I was there all day, and at 4:30, actually 5:30, they still hadn't, they just got down to the coffin, and it took 5 more days to uncover her grave. The woman there in the grave is a forensic scientist. Going down to that point was done with shovels, but from there on, it was done with a toothbrush. And they very carefully sifted every bit of dirt in that tomb, and in the process found every one of her bones except, well, not except, every one of her bones, including an extra rib. And the woman who did this, she said that these bones, though, were covered with arthritis, which meant all the walking that she did all over town constantly that was done in a very painful situation. There's three reasons why the church does this when somebody's being considered for canonization. The one is to assure that there was such a person, and to identify her body and secure it, so that if she is canonized, that somebody doesn't come out and monkey around with the grave. But the third reason is even more important, to put her body in a place which would be more accessible to people who wanted to come to her tomb and pray. And so she was moved. Her bones were moved into the cathedral after they had gathered them all up, and a very nice marker was put on the grave saying that she had been buried there, and that you could now find her in the cathedral. This was the first bone that was found, her skull, and as I say, every other one was found. She had only 5 teeth left, which, according to the scientists, meant that she, was a sign of the very poor diet that she had had on the slave plantation. When she was moved into the cathedral, her body was wrapped very carefully and was blessed, and was put into this box, which is made out of a luxuriant red hard wood from South America. That's not a box that's painted red. That is actually the color of the wood that of the box that she was her bones were placed in. And then a year later, that red box was placed into this marble sarcophagus, which was carved from the same quarry that Michelangelo's marble was taken from for the sculptures that he did. Investigation closed here in 2018, and about 12,000 pages of material was taken to Rome, and we didn't hear about anything going on for the next couple of years, and thought nothing was going on. But actually, somebody over there was appointed to look at all 12,000 pages of this and make sure that the investigation had been done properly. And once a decree was issued to that effect, then the cause would open in Rome, and they would the first thing that needed to be done, and is now in the process of being done, is for a person to take these 12,000 pages and write a posizio, it's called in Italian. It's I guess in English you could call it a position paper, which would demonstrate from the material that had been sent to Rome, would demonstrate that Julia had practiced the virtues to a heroic degree, and that there were people who considered that her intercession before God was very powerful, that they had asked, down through the years, had been asking for favors through her, and had received them. And so we're waiting for that position paper to be finished. And if after that, then there's 2 or 3 commissions over there that study that, and to see if they agree. And if they do, then it would be given to the Pope, and he would, we think that he would be very anxious to put his stamp on the approval on it. And after that, there has to be a miracle proven. That there's nothing we can do to bring that about. It's if Julia Greeley can through her intercession, God does something that there's absolutely no logical or natural explanation for it, that it would be declared a miracle and she'd be named a blessed, and then have to go through that one more time before she would be named a saint. There's a lot more to be said about Julia. I don't know how long I've gone here, but I could have gone all night and I wouldn't have covered everything that be said about her. But there's a lot in this book, and I think it's, unfortunately, it's about all we can say about her, because she's not around anymore, and there's nobody living that would have known her. And so it's a historical situation now. And unfortunately, she was, as a slave, was not taught to read or to write. So she couldn't leave us anything, you know, of her thoughts. And we have to depend upon what her friends and contemporaries told us, her left word of. And all of that, as far as we know, is in that book. The book is available at Garkin's religious store on religious goods store on 12th and Santa Fe. Or there's a form on our website, juliagreeley.org, that would enable you to order this book. It sells for $22. It's about 160 pages. That's the website I'm talking about. And Allison, I hope that was enough.
No, that was, yeah, that was absolutely wonderful. And I have a feeling people will likely have some follow-up questions,
Sure.
things they're curious about. So if you do, feel free to put those in the chat and I'll prompt Father Burkey with those. It's clear that you've done a ton of research on this topic. Is there anything as you were researching her life that really kind of surprised you, that you didn't expect you'd find when you started all this research?
Well, I'll tell you one. It's not a very religious thing. It's just quite the opposite to the way it ends. But we were surprised to find that she had a will. We think maybe the money that she got from Mrs. Gilpin. Anyhow, she had two pieces of property. They were in an area just on the west side of Denver called Mountain View. And this property, it had in the will, or the deed itself, it said it cannot be used for anything else than for a house to be built on it, which would be built for no less than $1,000, and that there could be no geese or hogs raised on the property. What that was about, I don't know, but that was, in the deeds where she bought it. But when she died, she left those two pieces of property and a little bit of money, and she named a man as the executor. And 8 years after her death, he still had not settled this estate, which is, rather strange, because it was just a small estate. She had no relatives, wasn't anybody to contest the thing. He didn't do anything except, I think, collect a executor's fee every year. And we found a letter which from a judge, the probate judge, and says, I want to see you in court tomorrow morning to explain to me why this case is still open. And so in the course of explaining it, we learned that the two pieces of property had been sold at a sheriff's sale because the taxes hadn't been paid, which he should have been paying as an executor. But and also that he couldn't find one of the orphanages, or 3 orphanages she left this money to. And one of them was a colored orphanage in St. Joseph's, Missouri. And he said he couldn't find it. I went on the internet and within 5 minutes found information about it. Not current information, but at the time itself, a contemporary article saying that they had just built and dedicated a new building on the site of this orphanage, which he couldn't find. So anyhow, I got to thinking, there's something really strange about this bird. I'd like to know more about him, and I started doing some research on him. I'll not write a book about him, but he, as it turned out, 2 years after the estate her estate was settled, there was an article in the Denver Press which said, in Judge Moore's court this morning in West Denver, this guy, when his trial was about to begin for extortion, he confessed, saying he'd rather be in jail than not, because he had gotten word from the North Side Italian colony saying that they were very unhappy about what he had done, and also told how one of the persons that he had bilked was an Italian grocer who he had taken $2,000 from. And the end of the article, it mentioned that he was being tried for having taken about $100,000 from different people's estates. That was all of that was a big surprise to me. It didn't exactly have anything to do with Julia Greeley, except that she was the one that was being persecuted again, even years after her death.
Oh, wow. Phyllis did ask if there is any information about like any family for her, relatives.
We've not been able to find any. We know there only the name of her mother and father, and we don't have any family name for them. The slaves at the time didn't have last names usually. This was part of the whole thing of slavery. They not only robbed them of freedom, they robbed them of their identity, their history. They couldn't read or write. So they had no way of preserving information about their families. If she had gotten in touch with her family, I guess if they were still all together at the time of the Emancipation, we probably would know more about her. But I guess her story would have been different then too.
Yeah, it sounds like it. And then also just kind of curious if you have a feel for these families that she was administering her charity to in the evenings. Do you think they were like families that were also members at her church? Like, how did she identify these if she's feasibly working all day and then kind of administering her charity all evening?
I have no idea. There's nobody you can ask.
Maybe that's her.
The best I can do is give a good guess, but I don't like to give too many of them.
Yeah, no, that's fair. Do you have an age that was attributed to her at her death? I have a question in the chat about that. Or an
Yes,
approximation.
yes. Let me find something in my book here and put it in front of me. In the book, I addressed that question. And to start with, there was a point when she got involved in the divorce trial of the Gilpins. And the first question was asked her, what is your name? The second question was, when were you born? And she says, I don't know, they never told me. But there were many people in the years who somehow decided that they would say how old she was. I have 12 different, I think it's 12 of them there, ages that were given at different times during her life. The first one, the earliest one was in 1880, the year right shortly after she came here. The United States Senate census lists her as being 40 years old, which would have meant when she died, she'd have been 78. And all these other ones we have even her will, and which she couldn't have written herself because she couldn't read or write. Somebody wrote that for her. And also the hospital, the mortuary, the different people that wrote about it, those three accounts in the newspapers, they all had three different ages. And so you put them all in order, and if the earliest that she would have been born was 1823 or earlier, and the latest would have been 1855. And at the time of her death, for each of these people extrapolating it, be anywhere between 63 and 95. But I think the best one would be the 1880 census, because she would have been the youngest of all the occasions when an age was given, and be more likely that people could guess how old she was. That's what I think.
And then we have another question in the chat about where she took her last name from.
We don't know that for sure, but we're pretty sure that it came from Horace Greeley. Horace Greeley was a newspaper editor who convinced Abraham Lincoln to issue the Emancipation Proclamation. And so he was much respected among the African Americans at the time. And we don't know that she ever knew him. It's the same person that Greeley, Colorado is named after, but it doesn't have anything to do with one another.
Yeah, wonderful. I'll leave the chat up for another minute or two if folks do have other questions, but I think at this point we're actually going to shift to the second portion of our program. So give us 1 sec to get situated here.
Oh,
It looks different, right?
yeah, it's interesting to see who's there.
Yeah, everybody's faces who've been watching this whole time.
So, Father, you mentioned that she worked for the Gilpins. Do you know, was she live-in help presumably, and she just did all the tasks that were asked of her?
When she was working for the Gilpins, yeah, she was living there with them.
Okay.
She's on the census, the 1880 census, as living there in that building with the Gilpin family.
Wonderful. And actually, Andrea, now that I am doing the screen share, if you do see other chats, like feel free to interrupt, because this is a slightly less formal portion of our program. And actually, we are going to ask, since now Father Burkey can see you all, or could see you all for a second, if you would mind letting us know where you're joining us from, this is going to help us tell SCFD that we're doing a great job serving the counties that pay into this very special cultural tax. And so while that's going, I'm going to talk a little bit about how the second half of our program is going to go. Andrea, my colleague from the Molly Brown House Museum, she's the director of the Molly Brown House Museum, is going to talk a little bit about how Margaret Brown kind of fits into this piece and her perspective on domestic workers. And then we're going to kind of expand a little bit into this topic of domestic workers, talk a little bit about their kind of workers' rights, their situation that they found themselves in for people like Julia. And then a little bit, we're going to touch briefly too on boarding houses as a concept. So just so you guys know where our evening is headed, and Father Burkey is going to stick around. If you do have more questions, feel free. We'll have a number of moments to continue to think about how all these pieces connect and answer any questions that you have. So,
Father Burkey, we had another question come into the chat. You mentioned that she owned property in Mountain View. Was there a date when she would have purchased that property?
Yes. I don't have it in my head, but that's it was. I think it was in the 1880s, and Mrs. Gilpin was still around. That's why I think that Mrs. Gilpin was involved with it. She wasn't living with the Gilpins anymore, but there we go. She bought them in 1889, and her promissory note was received clear title on January the 1st, 1891.
That's so
wonderful.
interesting.
Yeah.
It'd be great to maybe do a little bit more research too into those, or explore those properties and see what's there today.
There's no $1,000 house built on there. There's a commercial thing that does window tintings or whatever they call it, and also a building that sells pot.
Oh, here we go. Uniquely Denver, huh?
This in Mountain View,
Yeah.
right along 44th Street
Right.
or 44th Avenue.
Well, thank you everyone for participating in our polls and helping us find out where you came from. We also want to say hello to former trustee Ellen Idelson, who's joining us this evening in the audience, as well as Walter Huff, who currently serves on our board. So hello and thank you for joining us. When we think about sort of domestic service, labor and labor reform at the time, one top woman also comes to mind, and that's Jane Addams. We have this really long quote from Jane Addams, but she wrote frequently about the social conditions in domestic service and what it meant to be a servant at this time, and how that servant class was shifting as we think about sort of a post-Civil War America. And she's most famous for opening up the Hull House in Chicago in 1889 with Ellen Gates Starr. And they, in their Hull House, created a place for people to gain an art and literary education. Often they were new immigrants to America and Chicago, and they could learn English, they could learn cooking and sewing and technical skills, and also how American government worked. The residents who lived there at Hull House contributed to the activities and services. Those included nursery and kindergarten, public kitchen, and access to public baths and playgrounds. So all of these skills and trades that people could learn to help them move on in their careers. People could also learn music and art and theater, but just be a safe haven in the city. And so we might see later what were some of these safe havens, or we saw earlier some of those safe havens that Julia herself might have had. And like Julia Greeley, our Margaret Brown was born in Missouri, and even Hannibal, Missouri, in fact. So they have that in common. Margaret was born just after the end of the Civil War. Labor was really transitioning. We had women like Julia, formerly enslaved, trying to find a place in the labor market. And fewer women were tied up with their own forms of labor. So farm work and cottage industries that existed before the Industrial Revolution are waning as people are moving into cities. So we have these working girls, women like Julia coming online, Margaret herself, a working girl for some time. And they had some autonomy and some independence depending on their background and their color. And by 1890, 19% of women over 16 were in this labor force, with 68% of them never marrying, like our Julia. 26% of those were married Black women in domestic service, just to bring in money for their household. And by 1920, women were representing nearly 25% of the labor force, most of them being single immigrant women to the country. And these working conditions were often dangerous, and the hours were very long, and pay was very low. And domestic service, like Julia worked, was no exception. And this was sort of a disappearing servant class at the time. If you worked in a factory, at least the end of your 12, 14-hour day, the whistle blew and you could go home. But if you were live-in help like Julia, you'd often be called upon at all hours of the day and night. And even if you had a half day off, that could be usurped by the family's needs. The Browns, once Mrs. Brown, they moved here to Denver and were able to have a few servants of their own in the house at 1340 Penn. They would have had a lady's maid, a cook, one or more men to tend to the horses and drive the carriage. So there would have been several servants who would have lived in the house and then day help as well. We have one of the servants' rooms that when you visit the museum, you can see up on the 3rd floor. And you get to meet women like Julia Greeley, who were in domestic service. We have Mary Mulligan pictured with Margaret Brown. Mary actually got to travel with the Browns on the around the world trip to places like India and China and Japan. And then we have Mary Nevin, who was one of Margaret's earliest servants and friends up in Leadville. And she went on to raise a very large Catholic family herself. Some of the ways we know about things, just like Father Blaine did in his research, you look through records, you look through newspaper articles, and one of them here says servants of Mrs. Brown poisoned. So the family was too busy to eat dinner, so it sat out for hours. And then the servants decided to make lunch of what was left out, and some of them got food poisoning. So right in that great list, you can see there was a Sam Gleason, a Mary O'Fallon, Sadie Jensen. So we get to get sort of names and identities behind these servants who worked for the Browns. And then many were day help. So living in boarding houses, living in the neighborhood, and then coming in to help during the day. And we can see one of those in this city directory listing where we have Larson staff who are coming and working at the house. You can see a coachman for Mr. J.J. Brown at 1340 Pennsylvania Avenue. So we have those staff coming and going, living in the house, day labor, and they would have been expected to do multiple duties. For someone like Julia, that would have been cleaning and washing and ironing and all of the things that needed to be done to keep the household running. So Allison and I thought we would take a look at what was pay for domestic staff in Denver 125 years ago. This is from Rocky Mountain News in 1871 that said, good and faithful servant merits good pay, but if you have strong and willing laboring men can be employed for $20 or $25 per month, it doesn't seem reasonable that kitchen help should command very much more. So domestic service and domestic staff are getting relegated lower on the ladder than people who are laboring. And then when we were working on sort of how we talk about the servants at 1340 Penn, we found some of these great statistics. If you look at 1904 as compared to 2016, you can see what a domestic laundry worker would have made as compared to today. Nannies, line cooks, those sort of jobs that existed in Denver at the time and how those might have changed. And then for women in particular, you see like chambermaid, $15 to $20 per month with the room, 20 to 23 without room or board included. So you can see for general housework, it depended on if you were a house girl, a younger woman who would have come in probably your late teens, early 20s, versus a cook or pastry cook, you could get a little bit more money. And then again, some of those are dependent on if they're room and board or not. So perhaps if Julia Greeley was living with the Gilpins, her pay would have been dependent on her receiving room and board from the Gilpins as part of that. But of course, it's that room and board that is a huge part of whether you're able to sort of, make ends meet. So in 1904, rent was 13% of a family's income. You're able to look at to rent and want ads in the newspapers from the time. Furnished rooms were $8 to $16 a month. If you had food included, it could be $14 to as high as $30 a month, with most majority falling in that sort of $20 a month range. But if you're a domestic servant earning $30 a month, that's a significant percentage of your income. And then you're also paying transportation if, having to get on the trolley car to get to wherever it is you're working. So a significant percentage of your income is going to room and board and food at the time. And then of course, depending on what families you're working and things like that. Allison, you did all this great research. Do you want to talk about this?
Yeah, sure. I was just going to spend a little bit because, I think some of what was happening on that last slide is really this push and pull of like how much income you're bringing in and then how much you have to spend on housing. And again, obviously we're looking about a little 100 plus years ago, but some of these conversations are not dissimilar from ones we're having today. When we creep up to 43% of our income actually going toward housing, that makes it more challenging. And so I think in some respects, the boarding house does a couple things in terms of an additional form of housing. One, they're often really quick to set up. So if you have a house and you have an extra room, you can all of a sudden very quickly make income. So especially if we're thinking about some of the first people coming west and living in Denver, there probably weren't a ton of, apartment buildings in Denver at that time, but this flips it really quickly. They are frequently run by women, so it's a form of income if you're widowed, if you're married and maybe just not doing very well. And then it also allows for a lot of people to live really densely. And so I think all of those are kind of interesting in thinking about how and where Julia Greeley would have lived. And actually the picture behind me is again that and here it's listed as 2913 Walnut. I thought it was really interesting in Father Burkey's slides that the picture from the 30s has it listed as 2911 and 2915 Walnut, which I'll take a quick side note into primary documents, right? So I did some researching into city directories from the past, and that's kind of how I figured out who was living at 2913 Walnut at different years. What's interesting is in 1907, it looks like only one man is living there, and it's during the time frame in which Julia Greeley, we believe, was living there. This particular directory is missing all the G's. There are just no G's. And I think it points out there are a lot of layers to doing research in primary sources. One is sometimes they're flawed. Potentially the one that the Denver Library scanned was missing pages. The assessor record for 2913 Walnut is also missing. And I think that was also clear in Father Burkey's slides when he was showing us some of the newspaper headlines from 1918 at Julia's death. Those are words that we definitely would not use today in 2022, but kind of give us a little bit of insight into the perspectives of the people who may have been authoring some of those articles. So that's just my little aside of working with primary sources. But also I was just curious, and that's why I ended up doing this research in the city directories of who would have been living there, what kinds of occupations did the people who were living there have, and the city directories are a great way to kind of uncover that. I did think it was really interesting that one time it lists Julia Greeley as a cook and other times it doesn't. So it's possible that, you know, at different times when they're doing whatever they did to establish the directories, it depends how her occupation was listed specifically. And then in 1905, there are a lot of Conways living in the boarding house. And that was also just interesting. You know, I think we don't know for sure, but I think there's definite assumption could be made that there's some familiarity here. Potentially, this is one family renting multiple rooms. So again, just kind of interesting to think about this building and the people who live there. And I think also this housing type of a boarding house and why it kind of like would have worked. A lot of times, you know, their room and board was included. So the woman, it wasn't always a woman, but it was frequently a woman who was running the boarding house would also cook the meals, many times do laundry. Sometimes we also see her in some cases doing some childcare as well. So kind of an interesting housing model that I'm not sure, you know, we have Airbnb. I don't think it's kind of like that when you don't rent the entire house, but kind of close, but not exactly to solutions that we have come up with today.
Allison, there's a question. Did you look at the 1910 census records for this address?
I didn't. No. I
And what
probably
that
could
would-
have. I know I could have gone way down the wormhole, and I didn't. I just was kind of feeding my own curiosity about who was there. But no, the census, and actually probably, I don't know, Father Burkey, you probably did some census data too, looking at where she's showing up on different census reports. But I didn't do that for this. I'm sorry. The other kind of interesting piece, and
Actually, she is
Oh.
on the 1910 census listed at 2913 Walnut.
Perfect.
yeah, I figured you'd probably done the the other kind of thing that's interesting in Denver, and I think kind of comes at both sides, both from Margaret Brown's perspective as well from Julia Greeley's, is Denver actually had a very early attempt at setting up a domestic workers industrial union. And this, I think, is also kind of interesting in light of sometimes domestic workers were living in the homes. So if you unionized and you lost your employment, you actually lost your housing and your board. And so they had to actually put a lot of pieces in place to found this particular union, which included like lodging for the people that were part of the union and maybe losing their jobs because of it. The other thing that they did, and you know, this is, I think the article about the food poisoning kind of underlines that Margaret was a reasonably benevolent employer, but they were keeping records on who was nice to work for. And then basically the union was acting like an employment agency. So you would go there, it was located at 17th and Champa for a long time, or it only existed for 2 years. So within 2 years, most of its life, it was in this particular building. And you would get your employment through there. So they actually had an employment agency break in and try and destroy their records because it was so lucrative what they kind of amassed about all the places that you could possibly work in Denver, which I thought was kind of fascinating. And Denver's on the front lines of an early union effort there. And then let me check the time. I think we have enough time. We also wanted to this is a little clip that actually is really nice, kind of talks about how this union fits into the bigger puzzle of domestic labor. And Andrea, will you just give me a thumbs up if we get sound?
Yep.
No. Do you have sound?
It's still spinning, it looks like. I don't think we have sound, no.
I'm sorry about that. I think I can fix that.
Oftentimes exploited. If you can imagine only making like $8 a month for doing all of this grueling labor.
Domestic workers fought back, insisting that their labor had value.
They fought to establish parameters around their work by insisting on being paid a certain amount, by insisting on being limited to certain jobs. If they were hired as a cook, they wanted to be treated as a cook, not as a maid or as a child nurse.
Organizing often began with mutual aid societies, which women created to help each other in times of need.
Workers were able to pool their resources through these organizations that could help them if they decided to go on strike.
The largest and most significant domestic workers' strike of the 19th century began in Atlanta, Georgia in 1881. In early July, a group of 20 African-American washerwomen agreed on a standard rate for their work and began recruiting more women to join them. They called themselves the Washing Society.
The washerwomen connected on a daily basis through their labor. If you were a cook, if you were a maid, if you were a child nurse, you basically spent your day in the household of employers. But the washerwomen spent their days in their communal wash sites that they created to do the laundry together collectively.
Within 3 weeks, the Washing Society had 3,000 members. African-American cooks and housekeepers joined in solidarity. Irish immigrants also joined. They wrote a letter to the mayor making their demands.
We are determined to make extra charges for washing. Don't forget this. We mean business this week or no washing.
The labor was so important to the functioning of the city. Everybody needed clean clothes, and virtually everybody depended on the work of Black women to provide those clean clothes. And so they used that power by combining forces with one another in such a way that it gave them some leverage. They basically got the entire Black community behind them.
That fall, the Washing Society threatened to go on strike again, just as the city of Atlanta prepared to host the International Cotton Exposition.
Imagine Atlanta having the Olympics and then not having essential services provided. And here you had Black women workers saying, we're going to have a general strike. We're shutting down the city. That had a political impact that was unprecedented.
The employers struck back. Several women were arrested and fined.
The prison system became a mode of trying to really impose the notion that Black women could not engage in these acts of resistance.
These Black women were expressing their freedom, their unwillingness to accept this idea that they were second-class citizens.
Over the next few decades, inspired by a growing labor movement, domestic workers organized across the country. In 1919, in Rock Hill, South Carolina, striking domestic workers declared, "Let the white people learn to serve themselves. It will not harm them." In Denver, Colorado, 1,000 mostly Scandinavian immigrant women formed a union. They joined forces with the Industrial Workers of the World, a revolutionary union that sought to abolish capitalism. Their goal was to corner the labor market. Organizer Jane Street wrote,
We actually have power to do things. If you want to raise a job from $20 to $30, you can have a dozen girls answer an ad and demand $30. Stick to your domestic workers union, fellow worker.
This tactic had its roots in the washerwomen's strikes, and domestic workers would rely on it for many decades to come.
So that gives you a nice little overview of how this connects to the rest of our story here.
In the late 1800s, Black domestic workers entered the labor market as free people.
And you found too in your research, Allison, that Jane Street definitely wanted to include Black women in her union and support them in their labor struggles as well. Is that correct?
Yeah, I found, because they did mention that like hers was mostly Scandinavian women, but I did find this, she wrote a letter to a woman in Oklahoma who was trying to start her own union, where she advised against excluding Black women. And that she really felt like the way to be successful was to include all the domestic workers in the city. So I thought that was, kind of these interesting moments of potential like racial inclusion, at least in her mind, that this made sense. Oh my gosh, I'm so sorry. I don't know. There we go. Can't stop the video from playing. All right, so we wanted to make kind of pause that is almost the end of our presentation here, but make another pause for questions. These are some we thought you might have, but if you want to share some, actually, I can stop the share again for a second. If there's some in the chat that you guys want to address. But thinking through, it's a lot of different angles, and there were a lot of ways to look at the story from, but these kind of seem to be to make a lot of sense. So if anybody has specific questions, or here, maybe now I made you all scared to ask questions. I'll put ours back up.
Okay, that first question, I think I've answered that about as much as I can. The next, the step right now is to write that positio, and that's all happening in Rome. The other thing, though, with what the Guild is encouraging people to make their needs known to Julia Greeley, to ask her to intercede on their behalf. And the more people do that, the more likely that someday maybe we'll have a miracle that when we need it. So that's the thing that we can do. We can't work the miracles, but we can encourage people to ask for them. I visited some distant relatives down in Oklahoma one time who were Baptists, and they said to me, why do you pray to the saints? And this woman that asked me that, she had just before that said, I wish you'd pray for my brother because he has some problem or other. When she asked me that question, I said, well, you just asked me to intercede for you. That's just what we're doing with the saints. We know that they were holy people, and that they were closer to God than many others, and so we asked them to intercede on our behalf. And she was.
Yeah.
was satisfied with that answer.
Well, and I can add a little bit to the second question, because I mentioned at the beginning of our program that this was part of our 50 Actions for 50 Places campaign, which is kind of some of the way we got connected to Father Burkey. But my colleague is working with the owners of Planomatic. We definitely think this is an opportunity for more interpretation. And so thinking about interpretive signage so that the building actually bears potentially a physical sign on the exterior that talks a little bit about its history and its piece in Julia's story. I don't know of other ones though, but I know that's what we've been working on. And I know Andrea and I were kind of just talking a bit about, oh, I'm sorry to cut you off.
The third question there, how did you discover Julia's story? I think I could answer a little more on that. Back in the 1970s, there were some women here in Denver who knew Julia Greeley, and they were interested in discovering more about her. And so they, one of them wrote to the Denver Press a story along this line, and the Denver Press actually wrote some stories that it had uncovered. And then other people who read that article wrote to this lady, and also this lady and another lady who had written the first letter. They recruited the help of Father Pacificus Kennedy was his name. He was a Franciscan that lived at St. Elizabeth's, which is now on the Auraria campus. And he gathered, I don't know if he gathered them together, but he got in touch with maybe 30, 40 different people that had some recollection of Julia Greeley, or whose parents had told them the story. Some of it was secondhand, but and he wrote a couple articles which he published in a magazine back in New Jersey, which really didn't get much circulation out here. But he had all his notes, and there's a lady who actually still living here in Denver, who was recruited by the pastor of Sacred Heart Church to see if she could find out something. And she went and found Father Kennedy. He was, by that time, was living up in Boston. He was in his 90s, and he had all the notes that he had made. Letters had been written to him, and also this picture that he had gotten from Marjorie, and he gave all that material to this Mary Frances O'Donnell was her name, and she made copies of them, 3 copies, 3 sets of all this material, and gave one set to the Archdiocesan Archives, one set to Tom Noel, who I don't think he did anything with it. He gave it to the public library, which it ended up in the branch office over on Walton Street, and a 3rd copy to a man out in Aurora. And when my first thing when I was interested in studying this, I went down to the Diocesan Archives, and I thought maybe they would have something that, the Archdiocese had come up with, but they didn't have anything, but they had Father Kennedy's notes were there. I don't know if they'd done anything with it, they just had them. But I went through all that, and it was written on a lot of scraps of paper, back of envelopes and all sorts of things. He didn't have a tape recorder, But and there was a lot of letters also that people had written to him. But anyhow, I went through that whole thing, and so I eventually started going through that. And then I found reference on online that there was a Tom Noel's notes on Julia Greeley, and I went looking for them. And when I found them at the library on Welton Street, I realized these are the same things I just saw down at the Diocesan Archives. And then I eventually, when I had the book just about finished, someone told me, there's a man out in Aurora who has a lot of material on Julia Greeley. I tracked him down and found out he still had this package. He hadn't even opened it yet. And it was the third copy of these notes. So this woman had really done a good job of making sure this didn't disappear. And so then also, the next thing was just before I started working on this, the Archdiocese had gone through all the back issues of its newspaper, going back over 100 years, and had digitized them. So I was able to go in with a search engine and found over 100 articles that had been written over the years about her. Those were two big sources of my information. I found other stuff too, but
well, that's incredible. And I think it speaks to how beloved she was and how much she meant to Denver at the time. Thank you, Father.
Yeah, and just real quickly transitioning before we wrap up here this evening, I did want to talk about Saturday because there is an in-person component to this program if you'd like to join us. We are going to walk to a couple of the sites that we talked about this evening that were key to Julia's life. I will be emailing everyone that registered for this program, so you'll get this map again and an interactive link if it's more easy to navigate it that way on your device. So you're welcome to do it at any time, but if you want to join us on Saturday at 3:30, we're going to be starting here at Sacred Heart Church. They've kindly allowed us to park in their parking lot, and we have interior access to the church. We'll kind of do this leg here, and we also have interior access at Planomatic. So we're going to be going inside a couple buildings, really get to look at them both outside and in. I think it'll be really neat opportunity to kind of get a feel for the streets that Julia walked and how, I mean, given the years that we're talking about, how many pieces really kind of are still around. So again, you will get a reminder email with the parking information, the start time and location. But that is the plan if you're interested in joining us on Saturday. Andrea, do you have any other questions in the chat that we need to address?
I don't see any, no. Walter says, why isn't this history taught in our schools? This has nothing to do with CRT. So I think Julia Greeley is another one of those amazing Denver, Colorado women who will hopefully make it into the larger canon of people that we get to learn about in school and from here on out. So thank you, Father Burkey, for making that possible.
I'd like to add that, once her cause was opened, she became known all over the world in the Catholic world. There's people from many different countries that write to us asking for information about her, and there have been articles published all over not just here in Denver, but all over.
That's wonderful. All right. Well, hopefully I'll see some, if not all of you, this Saturday. And I think unless anyone has any other questions, we can wrap up for this evening. Thank you so much for joining us. We do have more programs, including right around the corner. Next Thursday, the 17th, is our Art on Pen series. So we'll actually virtually walk you through making your own Victorian collage. You can find out about that and all our programs on our website, historicdenver.org. So hopefully you'll join us for a special event, a program, or a tour at the Molly Brown House or one of our walking tours. So have a wonderful evening, and thank you all for joining us.
Thank
We'll
you. Thank you,
stick around
Father.
for another minute if there are additional questions.
Thank you. Very much appreciated.
Thank you, Walter.